Hi, everyone. Welcome to Politics and Prose. My name is Mishi. I am a team member here as well as an actor and a human rights researcher. Before we begin, we ask you to please silence your cell phones. And when we reach the Q&A, you can line up at the microphone by the pillar. Bryan Adams once sang the summer of '69, but today we're here to discuss the summer of '71, the subject of John Jenkins' new book. In summer of '71, Jenkins takes us back to 5 extraordinary months that helped reshape modern America. From the publication of the Pentagon Papers and the Supreme Court's decision to hear Roe v. Wade, to anti-war protests, the Attica uprising, and the growing constitutional crises surrounding Richard Nixon's presidency, he argues that this pivotal season continues to shape the political landscape we know today. John A. Jenkins is an award-winning journalist, author, publisher, and entrepreneur whose work has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, GQ, and the Washington Monthly. A 4-time recipient of the American Bar Association's Gavel Award Certificate of Merit, he is the founder of Law Street Media, former president and publisher of CQ Press, and co-founder of the predictive AI company, Policio Analytics. He'll be joined in conversation by David Myers, a longtime editor and newsroom leader focused on politics and democracy. Myers now leads media and communications at Open Secrets, previously founded the Fulcrum, and spent more than 2 decades in leadership roles at CQ Roll Call. So please join me in welcoming John A. Jenkins and David Myers.
Unfortunately, I told you yesterday that about 23. Very significant, this goddamn New York Times.
The egg was very disturbed by that New York Times thing. I thought that
Mr. President, I think
unconscionable damn thing to them to do.
we're not going to have any we just cannot tolerate this kind of anarchy.
Delay the action any longer.
The courage you showed and the judgment in not granting amnesty. Tell me this, are these primarily blacks that you're dealing with this?
The whole thing was led by the blacks.
I can now answer that they all died from gunshot wounds.
I think things are looking awful good for next year for you.
So, have David Myers with me tonight from Open Secrets, but I'm just going to, there are a lot of friends in the audience, and I appreciate it. Oh, am I supposed to be sitting here with a microphone? Okay. We've already blown it. But as you can see, 1971 was that summer of 1971 was an amazing 5 months that I think has largely gone untold. The story of this history has largely gone untold. So I want to thank all my friends and everyone else here that's in this full house tonight. I'm thrilled that you're all here. Please stick around for the book signing. I'll stay as long as you would like. I'm going to toss it back over to David Myers because he's to do the official introduction, and he's also going to be questioning me, but I think we decided in the green room, if there are questions, if you guys have questions, raise hand and we'll address them as we go. But anyway, turning it over to David.
Thank you, John. Good evening, everyone. We already got introduced by Mishi, so I think we'll jump right into some questions and conversation. First of all, congratulations, not only on the book being published, but today is release day. So
today is the
that's
release
awesome.
day.
Congratulations.
Yeah. Thank you.
And it's great being here to have this conversation on release day. So we saw in the video a number of themes. Can you walk us through what happened in very broad strokes in summer of 71?
Well, okay, so you saw the video. This is bookended by May Day, May 1, 1971. This was a very, very unpopular war happening in Vietnam right then. It's bookended by May Day on one side, Attica, you saw at the end, on the other, and in between, a lot of what I would say daring do secretly by the White House, by Nixon and his men, and also by the just incredible heroism of some of the people that are the main characters in this book. And I want to talk some tonight about those heroes as we get into it. But anyway, my feeling about the importance of this chapter in our history is that we hear so much about Watergate, right? Or the Watergate break-in in 1972, the Watergate hearings. I was present. I had a seat at the table in the Watergate hearings in 1973. 1974, Nixon's resignation. And there's even now this trope that's going around, this trope about, if any of you saw the coverage last week of Vice President Vance and saying that Watergate was really just a blip, and today it would be that it was the deep state against Nixon, and that today it would simply be a blip on the radar. Well, you read and you listen to the video, read the book, you'll see obviously that's not the case. But here's the story. J.D. Vance is one of the 70% of Americans that were not born in 1971. We don't teach this in civics. We've sort of lost the history, and that's why I wanted to write the book.
I want to follow up on something you said. I've read the book, and even though it's nonfiction, it reads like a novel. And every novel has heroes, and you mentioned heroes. Who are some of the heroes in the book that stand out to you?
Well, you saw at the outset of the video Daniel Ellsberg and Neil Sheehan, and I'm going to show my true colors by saying that today, to this day, 55 years later, there are ethicists and journalists who would possibly question that I'm saying Neil Sheehan is a hero. But to me, Neil Sheehan certainly is a hero. He found, so talk about the Pentagon Papers. There were these documents, it's 7,000 pages of secret report prepared largely by the Rand Corporation that showed the complicity of numerous administrations going back to Eisenhower, Truman, Eisenhower, JFK, LBJ, complicity in telling a different story than the truth to the American people about what was happening in Vietnam. And Daniel Ellsberg took these papers, briefcase by briefcase, ended up with 7,000 pages of these documents and multiple copies of those, and started trying to find a way to leak them in in and around Washington, and we are, you know, as anybody that's a reporter in this town knows, we leak like a sieve, still, right? So Daniel Ellsberg got these Pentagon Papers, and he got them eventually into the hands of journalist Neil Sheehan of the New York Times. How he did that is a story unto itself, and it takes up a good bit of the book. And it is not simply the matter of he gave the documents to Neil Sheehan. He didn't give the documents to Neil Sheehan. Neil Sheehan took the documents. He was given permission to read them, but he wasn't given permission to copy them or take them or give them to his newspaper. So there's a question here of, ethically, as a journalist, should we do that? My feeling, Dave and I were talking in the green room back just a moment before we came in here. I think he did what he needed to do. Neil Sheehan, as you will read in the book, excited great passion negatively and positively among his peers in the newsroom. By the way, I don't know whether his daughter Maria is here. Maria, are you here? I wish she was, because both of his daughters, Catherine and Maria Sheehan, were greatly helpful in preparation of this book. But Sheehan clearly is somebody that excites a lot of emotion, but he's doing the right thing ultimately in getting these documents out. And Ellsberg, who is on one hand a hawk originally, as he's in Vietnam, you see some images of him in the book, he turns into a whistleblower to give these papers to Neil Sheehan. So those two guys, for starters, are certainly heroes in my mind.
Let's talk a little bit more about Neil Sheehan. As anybody who's had a job and had managers knows, it's sometimes you have difficult employees or difficult managers. Neil Sheehan had a difficult relationship with his direct supervisor in the DC bureau. Tell everybody about how that worked.
A human resources problem. Neil Sheehan was to the New York Times, to many of the people in the New York Times, he was a problem employee, right? He was also one of the highest paid and best known people in that newsroom. But he worked on his own. What's fascinating about this, I'm going to digress to say something. I had access ultimately to 36 different collections of papers in various libraries. And 22 of those collections were at the Library of Congress. I'm going to be giving a talk tomorrow at the library about how I use those collections. But one of and probably the most fun I had, I know I've got at least two of my researchers here that I can see that are sitting in the audience tonight, but the most fun that I think, that I and my researchers had going through the Neil Sheehan papers at the Library of Congress, which I think many of the things probably that I was finding were being uncovered for the first time. I learned how to read Neil's hen scratching, just horrible script and cursive writing. But I taught myself by looking at letters or names that I knew the way he had formed these letters. And then I was able to basically decipher documents that I think no one had ever seen before. And certainly no one had ever deciphered. And I felt like going through that, I felt like I really had a chance to, even though I never met Neil Sheehan, I felt like I know this guy because he saved everything. You know, there are a number of people that whose papers we looked at that this could be said of. I have not an insignificant collection of papers myself at the University of Maryland, but I didn't save everything. And I wish, there's some of the things that I wished I'd saved. Sheehan saved every scrap of paper. If he got a message slip written to him, and whether the old style pink message slips that would have been put on his desk if he was missing for a few hours from his desk, he saved it. So I was able to actually see and write in the book and create a timeline. Who called him when, about what, and why, and did he, often I can tell whether he phoned them back. And he wrote memos incessantly. And I also had access to the papers of Susan Sheehan, his wife. Both of them are Pulitzer Prize winners back in the 80s. But the two of them were just terrific note takers and savers, and that was really also helpful. I forget what the question is, but that's the answer.
So I was hoping you would talk about the relationship that Sheehan had with Max Frankel, his boss
Max
in the
Frankel.
Bureau,
Okay.
and
Yep.
Abe Rosenthal.
Right. Abe Rosenthal and Max Frankel. Okay. These are two. So you're dealing with up front in front of you are two news hounds, right? So I'm a journalist. David is as well. And so we tend to gravitate to the great inside baseball stories like this. Okay, I'll set it up for you. So Abe Rosenthal, A.M. Rosenthal, is at this point the great power as editor of the daily newspaper at the New York Times. Interestingly, he does not control the Sunday paper at this point. It's different now. But at this point in time, in 1971, Rosenthal is in charge of the paper 6 days a week, but not Sunday. There's a different Sunday editor. And that means that the magazine and the book review are also under this other editor, not Abe Rosenthal. But Abe Rosenthal has previously been the Southeast Asia correspondent for the Times. He's been all over Asia. And he met Sheehan when Sheehan was a reporter for UPI in Vietnam. So they became friends, and I think that it would be said they became lifelong friends. Abe Rosenthal ruled that newsroom with an iron fist, and he had his favorites and those that were not so much his favorite. But Neil Sheehan was one of Abe's very favorite reporters. And so others in the newsroom felt that he got some slack cut sometimes, not justifiably. Now, so that Rosenthal's the editor, Neil Sheehan is in the Washington Bureau, and there is somebody in between them. Anybody that's worked in an organization of more than 3 people, you know that personalities being what they are, this can happen. So the person between the two of them is a guy named Max Frankel. Max Frankel just passed away, I think, within the last year, actually. And Abe and Neil are not with us for a longer period of time. So Frankel is the head of the Washington Bureau, and he also resents the privileges that he thinks Sheehan has gotten by missed deadlines, gets to work on a story. He was supposed to be the Pentagon correspondent, but he didn't really like the beat. There were all these memos back and forth. Interestingly, although Sheehan's papers are at the Library of Congress, the New York Times files are at the New York Public Library, and they are extensive. And so what I was able to do was triangulate between Sheehan's documents in Washington and then the New York Times company files, which includes a diary that Abe Rosenthal fortuitously began keeping in the months before he actually learned about the Pentagon Papers. So you can read in real time in his diary how the first time in March that he learns that they have these secret documents that they might get arrested for having, and a lot of even members of Congress who had access to them didn't want them. Ellsberg would try to give them the documents, they would refuse, but Sheehan had them. So there were these 3 very, very strong personalities, and then remember, the Sunday paper is under different management altogether. So Sheehan is sometimes writing for the magazine, so is his wife Susan, and he's also doing book reviews. And so he's kind of freelancing inside the newspaper, and there is some resentment about that even. And basically Rosenthal kind of takes a hand off and decides that this is a third rail. Neil's outside work and his various things he had written in March, right before the Pentagon Papers comes out, Sheehan writes a book review, and the title of this book review is basically says, "Is Nixon guilty of war crimes?" Right? And there's big furor in the newsroom, but they can't control it because it's the Sunday paper, right? So, and Rosenthal gets a letter. There was a guy named, some of you might remember, the CBS newsman. He was a disciple of Edward R. Murrow. His name is David Schoenbrunn. And Schoenbrunn is a friend of Rosenthal's, and he sees this, and he thinks it's just the greatest thing that's ever come out of the newspaper. So he sends a letter to Abe Rosenthal, and Abe says, he answers by saying, "I'm going to pass it along to the Sunday editor. I didn't have anything to do with it." He just doesn't want to touch that. But so the strong personalities and the dynamics between them are pretty incredible.
Before I get to my next question, as John said, we want to open this up and make it a conversation with everybody involved. So if you do have a question, I ask you to come up to the mic, and you can be first in line after I get through my next one.
And we have some researchers that are familiar with in the audience that are as familiar with some of these papers as I am. So you guys feel free also. Anyway, go ahead.
Going back to what you were just talking about, do you think a beat reporter coming to the Pentagon today could write that same piece? Is the president guilty of a war crime?
Oh, good. Okay. I told David to throw me curveballs. Okay. Could the Pentagon reporter at the New York Times today write a book review, is the White House or is the president guilty of war crimes? I guess it's theoretically possible, and maybe it's even, I would say, full disclosure, I worked for the Times Magazine during the 1980s, doing some very major stories about the Supreme Court. So I know a little bit about the dynamics of the paper and the Sunday magazines versus the daily press. I think that it could happen, and might even be more likely in some ways that it could happen today, because I think that compared to my feelings about the Times and its attempts to sort of straddle as a newspaper of record all sides of an issue, I think, frankly, if there's anybody here from the New York Times, stand up and disagree with me. I think they're less likely today to feel that compunction than before. So I think theoretically it's possible. And certainly one could make the argument that that has been made that that could be happening now.
So now that I've opened the door to talking about what's happening today,
okay. Yep.
Let's talk about parallels between what the issues you wrote about in summer of 1971 versus what's happening today. What are some of the broad strokes you've seen?
Well, one thing is press freedom is under attack in 1971, and it is under attack today also by the powers that be in the White House. And it was overt. It was overt. And we have the benefit that Richard Nixon taped everybody that came into the room. Anybody that he spoke to on the phone, he taped. So we know what his motivations were in terms of press freedom under attack. Something you didn't ask me about, but I think it's relevant to the fact that Nixon did all that, did that taping. Henry Kissinger did not tape, but he had 3 secretaries, stenographers, that listened in on every phone call and took stenographic shorthand notes of the call and immediately transcribed them for Kissinger. Those transcripts also exist at the Library of Congress. And we downloaded all of them from the Library of Congress, and we were able, using the White House transcripts, the White House tapes, and also Kissinger's transcripts, we can create actually an even more vivid timeline than just looking at Nixon's actions and tapes and himself. So one of the things that I did in this book was I was able to create the path from how did Nixon decide that he was going to make this attack on the press, attack press freedom and prior restraint. Okay, so I think one could say Nixon never liked the mainstream press. He never supported it. That's clear from his writings, and even 1962 when he loses the governorship and he says you're not going to have Dick Nixon to kick around anymore. He never liked the press. But what is interesting here is that Henry Kissinger, because you have to understand Kissinger's role in Vietnam. Kissinger straddled as a sort of perceived expert with Harvard credentials multiple administrations, not just Nixon. He was he was a Rockefeller man, and he was a very unlikely national security advisor, as I say in the book, to Nixon. But Kissinger had a role in the Paris peace talks, and allegedly in the last volume, volume 37 of the Pentagon Papers, created a diversion so that the war would be continuing and not ended at the moment of the election. LBJ had tried during the last 2 weeks of the election to turn things around for his former vice president, who was in the unlikely spot since LBJ jumped out of the race, of being the nominee, even though that vice president had not run in any primaries. By the way, you asked about parallels. Does that sound familiar? That happened. That happened. So Kissinger is in Paris and as a back channel, kind of trying to prevent the Vietnamese from negotiating in a way that would possibly create a groundswell for Hubert Humphrey. He's mentioned in the Pentagon Papers, volume 37. So, Pentagon Papers now become revealed by the New York Times. Nixon initially has this feeling, this is not about me. This is about prior administrations. This isn't something that we should worry about. But you heard General Haig, these voices, someone asked me about the movie, are those real voices? Yes. That was Rockefeller at the end. That was Nixon. That was Henry Kissinger. Alexander Haig, who was Kissinger's number 2, the General Haig at that point. So Kissinger, and aided and abetted by Haig, persuade Nixon that this is that the Pentagon Papers are treasonous and should be stopped at all costs. And they persuade the Attorney General to go and seek prior restraint in a case that goes all the way to the Supreme Court. The path to that really happens because in my opinion, Henry Kissinger does not want the full story of the Pentagon Papers out. And in fact, he has this huge feud in the book with Bill, and in life, with Bill Rogers, Secretary of State William Rogers. Rogers calls him up and he's caught on these Kissinger transcripts. Rogers says, what can you tell me about the Pentagon Papers? Kissinger says, I don't know anything about them. Rogers says, you have them. Kissinger says, no, I don't. Rogers, yes, you do. Rogers knows he's got them because he's got the list of the Rand Corporation and who got the papers. Kissinger finally says, well, maybe we have them, but I've never read them. I don't know anything about them. Rogers, at this point, somebody that was talking to me about this the other day says, everybody's lying to each other. Well, welcome to Washington, right? Right? That's what's happening. But that's one of the parallels to today. Press freedom under attack. One thing I will say, I think the Supreme Court, back then in 1971, the Supreme Court moved very, very quickly to stand up for the press, for the New York Times in US v. New York Times, and allowed the publication of the Pentagon Papers to continue. I don't know what the outcome would have been today. I can tell you probably, this is a parallel, but it's maybe not exactly the same. I would say today, the Supreme Court certainly would slow walk it. The court back in 1971 actually stayed in session into July in order to decide that case.
Let's talk about parallels and protests. In the past year, we've seen No Kings rallies, and going back further, there's been the George Floyd protests and other things going on. 71, where you talk about May Day and Attica and other protests like that. Are you seeing the same kind of ideas coming through these protests?
We see the same kind of ideas coming through the protests, but I have to say, and this is something where political scientists and theoreticians talk about the the continuum of autocracy and the kind of conduct that you would see sometimes in much more authoritarian regimes, right? So it's a continuum. And we're sort of along that, we were along the continuum in 1971, and we are back on that same continuum again. But in some ways, we haven't really gotten to the point yet. It's a parallel, but we haven't really gotten to the point where we would have, remember what you saw in the video, that was not AI. There were 101st Airborne infantrymen with fixed bayonets landing in Chinook helicopters on the Washington Monument grounds with fixed bayonets and routing a bunch of people that were there that had actually received a permit to camp and to protest against the war. the White House concocted a scheme by which in the middle of the night, the permit would be pulled, and the author of that, the authority that gave Nixon, was William Rehnquist. And he created, I'm Rehnquist's biographer. I have I think you could still buy that book here too. I'll sign it. In 2012, the book is called The Partisan, The Life of William Rehnquist. And I interviewed Rehnquist for the Times Magazine. After that interview, he said he would never give another interview. But I got the interview. So what happens is John Mitchell, the Attorney General, and Nixon pull the permit, and they then send in the National Guard, and they actually call in also the 101st Airborne and some other soldiers, and arrest all of the protesters that were planning on protesting on May 1st against the war. Protesters were trying to shut down the federal government, and they did not fully succeed, but a lot of them got arrested. 13,000 were arrested. We have never had, 13,000 were mass incarcerated, more arrests. We haven't had that level yet of repeated as it happened in 1971. By the way, there may be some ACLU lawyers in the audience, I have a feeling. The ACLU won the case against the Nixon administration for that mass incarceration. You saw a photo of it there. They penned 13,000 people in a practice field outside of RFK Stadium. No facilities, no food. People were bringing food and throwing it over the fence. And actually in the book, there is a scene with Anthony Lewis. These are another great newspaper story. Anthony Lewis and Bill Sapphire, both arguing with each other by letter over whether those May Day protesters should have had ACLU representation or whether they should have won that case. But I would say, in terms of parallels, it hasn't gotten back to the point that we would have 101st Airborne or soldiers with fixed bayonets running around. It's some of us may think it's close, but I don't think we're there yet.
All right. Any questions from the audience? Anybody want to step up to the microphone?
And we can also repeat the question, but
sure.
Hello. A little partial to this topic. Good to see you again.
This is Noah Feiwell, who is one of my great researchers. Here along with Caitlin Doherty, who's also here. Yes.
Woo.
All right.
Having not read the book, but having seen a lot of these papers, one thing that really struck me in the course of research was how dramatic these stories really were. Like these are things that, had they been occurring today, maybe they would have been a radar blip. Maybe this would have been like the 24-hour news cycle for weeks. Now that you've gone through the process of compiling and analyzing and putting this narrative together, how much do you think the way that these events affected America was due to the news ecosystem at the time, especially compared to how news gets distributed today in a social media internet environment?
Okay, so really the question is, in 1971 we had fewer media outlets, and they were sort of, we were getting our news from the nightly news programs. There was cable basically didn't exist, and we had some flagship newspapers, and they were the opinion leaders of our time. Today, with the fragmentation that we have and the polarization that we have, I think probably you'll see it, actually. You'll see it between the reaction. Well, let's just talk about J.D. Vance's comments at the Nixon Foundation, at the Nixon Library the other day. There is probably a large group of people that agree with that it was a blip and that it shouldn't, that it's a non-issue. Remember what I said at the outset. Nixon was the deep state. He was the deep state. So I think that it probably helped that there were the Walter Cronkites, the CBS Evening News guys of the world that were here that could sort of set the tone for the public debate. And that is, now we are so fragmented. we have many, many podcasters, bloggers, media outlets, and they're all setting the terms of their own debate. So I think it is probably different. That said, I think about heroes, and I think we do have heroes. We certainly had heroes in 1971, people that stood up and made a difference at the end. We haven't talked about Sarah Weddington, but I consider her a huge hero in Roe versus Wade, and she's successfully arguing this case. She's 26 years old, 25 when she first argues it. And so I think we will yet see, and I'm confident that we will yet see heroes coming out of the current maelstrom that we find ourselves in. Unfortunately, probably not assisted by the leading lights of the evening news the way maybe a half century ago we were. Another question.
So you talk about parallels, but we have the National Guard here now, and they're staying because he believes there are going to be protests to come, and he already has them in place. You won't have to wait for the 101st Airborne. Is that not
Is
a
there
parallel?
is there a question?
Is that not a parallel?
Well, that's definitely a parallel. The National Guard on the scene. So I just came through Union Station. Washington is my home. I was away from D.C. before I came in yesterday, and came back for this event and some others that we're having. So you see the National Guard. You see them largely, in this case, confined to a few areas, I think, from what I'm able to see. I live nearby. I live in Northwest Washington. But clearly it's a parallel. Clearly it's a parallel. It cannot be denied. And this is the first time, there's a difference, I think, between the National Guard was called in, let us remember, Kent State, 1970, okay? National Guardsmen, let us not forget this. National Guardsmen killed 4 students at Kent State. I was a student at the University of Maryland. We have the Dean of Merrill College here. Right, yes. I was a student then, and we had the National Guard on campus. I lived just off campus, and we were under a state of martial law. By the way, the memo that I should get back to this. I'm going to jump back to the Rehnquist memo that allowed martial law, that allowed the calling of the troops in the National Guard. Nixon wanted a justification for it. This is in the book. Rehnquist created a legal doctrine that did not exist in actuality. Was called limited undeclared martial law. Okay, so I likened this to double secret probation in Animal House, right? So this and no, there's no legal reference for it. But Nixon said, okay, that's great, we can do it. I don't know that our current president even has that justification, but he certainly has brought back elements of this kind of martial law. I think anyone who lives here would agree that right now the National Guard seems to me to be an innocuous, unneeded presence. But unfortunately, they also are representative of what people want, what some people would want us to think about Washington, D.C. By the way, Nixon called D.C. crime capital of America in 1971. Here we are again, right? Yes, sir.
I have a question about the reflecting pool.
Okay.
I'm sorry. That was a different okay.
That's good.
No.
That's good. Get up here.
My question is, you said you had a seat at the table at the Watergate hearing.
I did.
Could you talk about that? That was like the thing that happened, and it had everybody's attention, and it was like, what's going to happen?
Yes. Okay. So, why 1971? This was the first year that I was a young reporter in Washington. I was three credits shy of graduation from the University of Maryland when I began what was an internship, really, a summer internship at a company called BNA that stood for the Bureau of National Affairs. It was bought. It's now Bloomberg BNA. It now became part of the Bloomberg empire. I had no idea that a company like this existed, but my advisors said, and this is something that I owe the university hugely for, my advisors said, this is the right place for you, and we want you to have a job there. So I walked into the newsroom. I'll get to the question of how did I get to the Watergate. I walked into the newsroom, and this is already a big enterprise that's just completely flying under the radar of the New York Times and the Washington Post and other and the networks. But we were covering the same stories with a periodical press group of hundreds of reporters covering the same stories side by side with all of the big media outlets. Now, the importance for a company like Bloomberg BNA is in the official text, the documents. So in those days, there was no internet. A company that was making a business decision was unwilling to rely just on a story, even in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. They wanted to see the document. The people that could get the documents were accredited reporters. We were accredited reporters in Washington. And basically, what my bosses in the daily newsroom wanted was the documents. They didn't want my reporting. They wanted the documents. But we had seats at every hearing, at every table. And when the Watergate hearings began in 1973, our Senate correspondent, they were in the caucus room, and the romanticism of those hearings in those days, particularly for a young man, 22, 23 years old, was just incredible. And so the Senate reporter actually had real work to do. We weren't covering the Watergate hearings really as a news story the way the Times and CBS was, or and the other media outlets, but we had a seat. And so I was the seat warmer, basically. And any chance I could get, including the opening day and first day of John Dean's testimony and many, many days, sometimes I see photos and I'm in the daily historical documents, and I try to see, can I see myself? Because I know exactly where I sat. I sat across from this guy from the Albuquerque Journal. Joseph Montoya was one of the senators on the committee, so the Albuquerque Journal was there every day covering any questions Montoya would ask, which were usually not very good questions, but he was trying to lay the groundwork somehow. But anyway, so we had this seat, and really we couldn't spare any of the actual reporters that were doing more important coverage, and I was the young guy in the newsroom that if there was a possibility for me to go, my editor would let me do it. So I was there for most of the days, at least part of every day, particularly if I had a hearing to cover on the Hill, and the Watergate hearing is about to begin, I would plop right in. I would still get to do my other work, because remember, all we had to do was get the handouts. So that's how I ended up in the hearing. I have one story. John W. Dean was the White House counsel. He was the author of the memo that you saw in this video today of doing a job on our enemies. Nixon had asked him for that memo. But by 1973, he has turned, and he's now a whistleblower. He's testifying against Nixon, and he's one of the most hated people by the Nixon administration, still in power in 1973. And so I'm present for the first day of John Dean's testimony. John Dean is still very much with us as a commentator and a good man. I'm there for the first day of Dean's testimony, and I hear suddenly a ruckus behind me, and I had my seat on these long tables in the caucus room happened to be kind of at the end of the table, not the closest to the senators, but sort of closest to the audience. Right in the next row behind me, in walks John Lennon and Yoko Ono to hear the testimony. And Lennon had shaved his head, and I thought of this guy as the Beatle with lots of great hair and everything. And I was surprised by any number of things, seeing them for the first time. They both actually were very slight. And I think they'd been on a hunger strike or something in 1973. But Lennon and Yoko were there, and every day there was some VIP in the audience. I remember one day Jimmy Breslin, this guy from the New York Post, is sitting behind me, and is just I knew somebody behind me is just swearing a blue streak. Who is this person with this very, very deep kind of Queen's accent? And I look around, I recognize instantly, it's Jimmy Breslin. So for a kid, new guy in Washington, this was just catnip. I loved it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I want to switch topics for a second. You brought up Roe v. Wade earlier.
Right.
We haven't really talked about it, even though it's probably the most widely recognized thing that happened during this time period. I mean, people have heard of the Pentagon Papers, but everybody's heard of Roe v. Wade.
Okay, agree. Everybody's heard of Roe versus Wade. Yep.
But I think most of us, and me included before reading the book, didn't really understand the story of how that case was argued and Sarah's role in it. Can you give us some of the background on that?
Sarah Weddington is, in this book, is 25 years old in 1971. And she is a brand newly minted lawyer with a graduating from University of Texas Law School. I think one of the only women in that class, and she is a newly minted lawyer with definitely civil liberties intentions, and she becomes friends with others that have started representing women in Texas. She's from Texas. Women in Texas that need an abortion, that want an abortion and cannot get it. Abortions were beginning to be legal in a few states. DC under certain circumstances, New York, yes, for sure, but mostly not. But you could see they were advocates for choice were looking for the right case to take. And so in the book, it describes how Sarah Weddington, at age 25, first becomes a kind of a law clerk to someone else that is going to probably argue this case, a man. But somehow, as things, and I had the benefit of having her papers as well from Texas Women's University, and somehow during the course of this, it's decided that we need a female. There are two other female lawyers that are working on these cases. They need someone who can speak well, argue well, and can represent the plaintiff, who is Norma McCorvey, in this case, the Roe of Roe versus Wade. Wade was the district attorney for in Houston. So she gets this case, and what really struck me about it was the maturity of someone that had hardly had any trial experience, let alone is able to go into and argue a case not once but twice before the justices. There's an image that we have in the book that I think that just really captures, again, Sarah Weddington is no longer with us. I never met her, but I feel in a way that going through her papers and her letters to her parents over this course, and which are documented in the book and talked about in the book, I feel like I knew her in some way. There's this great photograph that is included in her papers of an early meeting that she has for abortion rights in Texas, and you'll see it in the book. I said, I want to make sure, I told the editors, I want to make sure that we don't cut off any part of this picture, because behind the rostrum, she's got a high heel on, but she's got her foot out of the heel. She's just like relaxed, you know? And so she was just terrific. She argued the case against the DA, the guy that was arguing for the district attorney in Texas, and he made what is considered by many to be the worst joke ever in front of the justices about following a pretty lady, how difficult it was going to be for him to win this case, since he was following a beautiful young lady before the justices. And I listened to her making this argument, and there's just dead silence from the judge. Nobody said anything. And that kind of set the stage for where that case, I think, ultimately ended.
Do you know where Sarah's career went from there?
Oh, yeah. She had an illustrious, so keep in mind, 1976, Nixon by then is out, and Gerald Ford is the unelected vice president who became the unelected president. And in 1976, the pendulum swings. There's a reform movement. Jimmy Carter is elected president, and she was his White House counsel. So I think in some ways, still as a very, very young woman in Washington, I'm not sure how much she enjoyed it, but I think she learned a lot, and then she ultimately went back and became a noted lawyer in Texas and educator and politician.
We have time for a few more audience questions if anybody has anything they'd like to ask John. While you're thinking, the issues you wrote about are obviously things that were known, but I imagine there's something new you discovered somewhere along the way in your research. Anything you're willing to point out?
Right. Yes. Well, there were a couple of things actually that are, I think they're nuggets in this book, but I think they're worth, they're certainly worth mentioning, and historians, I hope, will pick up on them, and one in particular, and I can talk about that. So we went through the papers of Averell Harriman. Averell Harriman is at this point, he's the governor before Nelson Rockefeller. Rockefeller, the man whose voice you heard tonight, Rockefeller has defeated him for governor, but Harriman is still very, very involved with LBJ and with kind of what you would call, I guess, the respectful opposition once Nixon comes in. He's got a mansion in Georgetown. He runs basically the equivalent of a salon. He's got a lot of money. His family owned the Union Pacific Railroad. And his papers at the Library of Congress are also extensive and probably, particularly for 1971, have probably never been looked at before I got into them. I don't know this for a fact, but I would probably doubt it. So it's easy, since we're inside the guardrails of 5 months. I'm able to look at everything that he did or associate himself with in 1971. And one of the things that I came across was he still had this deep affection for Lyndon Baines Johnson, for LBJ. And he and his then new wife, Pamela Harriman, visited LBJ. It turned out a month before Johnson died. He visited LBJ a month before the LBJ's passing, and LBJ is, he dies at 64. He's got a bad heart, he's got emphysema. He goes out onto the porch after dinner, and he's on oxygen, but he's smoking, right? I mean, it's insane. And Harriman is documenting a memo to himself about this unbelievable interaction he's having with Lyndon Johnson. Johnson's unburdening himself. And one of the things that he tells Averell Harriman is he doesn't believe that there was not a conspiracy to murder JFK, his predecessor. Johnson just confesses and says flat out, I believe that it was the Cubans. I believe that that Lee Harvey Oswald was motivated by Castro and the Bay of Pigs. And you have to, for those who don't know history, look up the Bay of Pigs. But this is incredible. I'm reading this and I'm like, surely something like this has already been revealed. Surely I am not the first person 55 years later to be writing about this, but I think I am. This afternoon, because I've been doing a lot of interviews, and I've been asked about this, and so I wanted to verify, did Robert Caro, did he get this? So I looked at the version, at his fourth in his series, the one that I think is out, the most recent one that he's published, The Passage of Power. And I looked to see if he used the Harriman papers. He did not. It turns out there was an Atlantic magazine article in 1973 that another reporter who had interviewed Johnson, also I think in the year before his passing, intimated that Johnson didn't have confidence in the Warren Commission. Mind you, Johnson appointed the Warren Commission. That was the whole, his whole thing, and this is what Caro talks about, was to try to create the legitimacy of the Warren Commission and never to question it so that the country could move on. But this is the first time that I think anyone has actually documented flat out, and this is a contemporaneous memo. Harriman wrote it immediately upon his return from Texas. But he dictated everything. He had an assistant at his house. What a life. And he dictated everything, and it was all typed up and put in these papers and for somebody to find one day, and I found it.
It's great investigative work, John.
Well, there you go. Yes. Jeff.
You talk a little bit about the significance of Attica. You mentioned
Right.
you haven't spoken much about it.
Okay, the significance of Attica. I've mentioned it and I haven't spoken about it. And I know Noah, who's sitting in the front row, was my researcher on that. First of all, what were we able to find? We found at the Library of Congress what is maybe the only extant version of the hearings of the Attica Commission. We read them and copied them in their entirety. They are incredible. What is Attica and how did it happen? There's another chapter in this book that we haven't talked about, and it's Angela Davis and the Soledad brothers, and that is the precursor to Attica. There is the Soledad is a prison in California, and there is a brilliant young man, George Jackson, who has written by this time a best-selling book from prison. He's been in prison since basically he was a teenager, and he pleaded guilty at the suggestion of a public defender to a minor offense, something as maybe insignificant as shoplifting or as taking something from a service station. But then he's arrested a second time, and on this, under the law, he becomes then potentially a lifetime felon in prison. And he rebels against this, and it only damages him more, and he's getting deeper and deeper into the solitary confinement and penal system. And finally, there is such a huge groundswell of support at this time for his life and to have justice for him. And Angela Davis, who has never met him in person, becomes his principal defender, if you will, and somebody that and principal organizer, and becomes a firebrand on behalf of George Jackson. Then there is George Jackson ends up getting murdered after he attempts an escape. And I relate the story. We don't have enough time here for it tonight, but it's in the book, and it's an unbelievable story. I mean, it almost boggles the mind, first, how George Jackson can get a gun inside prison to try to escape, and then the guards kill him and others, and it becomes a huge riot at Soledad prison. Now, when the inmates of Attica in New York hear about this, they go on strike. And so, like everything that happens in this book, there's always a precursive element. And so the precursor in this case is the death of George Jackson, the murder of George Jackson, but also the murder of other prisoners and guards during this melee in Soledad. And then the Attica prisoners initially go on hunger strike. They go on. They call in sick. They're trying to, not only in sympathy and support for the Soledad guys that are called the Soledad brothers, but also because the conditions are deplorable. And one of the things that we looked at when the researchers and I, as we found these hearings, we read the transcripts, and it's just astonishing. To this day, the state of New York still seals all of the evidence that it gathered about Attica. We have the hearings. The hearings were actually broadcast on the local PBS channel in New York when they were taking place. But the state of New York still has, we attempted to verify and see if we could get some of the records from Attica. We have a few photos that were smuggled out and that we could get rights to in the book, and we have some in the book. But ultimately what happens in Attica is it devolves into a riot where guards are taken hostage. And the inmates actually other than one guard that was injured, badly injured, and later died, no other guards who were taken as hostages are actually harmed. But this is all kinds of rumors are spreading throughout the prison and elsewhere that that guards have been mistreated and are under probably that some of them actually the rumor is that they've been killed already. Their throats have been slit. You heard Oswald, the corrections commissioner, finally at the end he says they all died of gunshot wounds. The gunshot wounds were from the sharpshooters from New York State troopers who ended up killing 44 men, most of them prisoners, during this riot in 1971. I think it's largely forgotten. There's a great book that won the Pulitzer Prize a couple of years ago for history. I momentarily forget the name, but some of you probably will know it. And I use that as a reference for my work. But really, we worked from documents, and the documents we worked from were the actual hearing transcripts that probably were gathering dust somewhere until we found them and wrote about them. But it was a tragic issue that I think Attica still exists as a prison, and I would not be surprised if it's not fundamentally different from back then. That's Attica.
So one of the first topics we talked about was Neil Sheehan and whether he crossed an ethical line, and it really makes for a great movie or book just in terms of the investigative nature of it, separate from John's investigative work, but it's the story of how they had safe houses and smuggled papers, but then it raised the question of whether he did the right thing or the wrong thing. I think as we wrap this up, I just want to wet everybody's whistle with another similar story about Angela Davis. We're not going to get into it now, but just to tease people, there's a great legal drama about Angela Davis and her trial and whether the right decision was made. We've gotten the high sign we need to wrap up, but
yeah,
we haven't talked about it tonight. It's worth reading about.
It's worth reading about. Angela Davis was found not guilty. The Nixon administration went after her, you saw in the video, as complicit in first-degree murder during a takeover of another courtroom where a judge and 3 other prisoners were killed, and she bought the guns. So there was an arguable case of is this also something that we should go after this person, Angela Davis, for? And she was on the run for months, and ultimately is caught by J. Edgar Hoover's FBI. There is a trial. Interestingly, and this is a grace note in the book, she does not act as she gets permission to act as her own lawyer, which enables her to speak to the jury during the voir dire, but without being subject to cross-examination during the trial. But she gets to present herself. And I think that was probably very important to this jury when they found her not guilty of murder back then.
So we're out of time, unfortunately. But John, congratulations again on the great book.
Thank you.
And for joining us here tonight.
All right. Thanks a million. Thanks everybody for being here.
And thank you all for being here.